the sound that shattered silence. The Galactic Preservation Institute floated in the void between star systems, a monument to the collective wisdom of 300 civilized species. Its crystalline halls housed the galaxy's brightest minds, each carefully selected from worlds where evolution had favored caution over courage, calculation over risk. Here, in laboratories sealed against the universe's harsh realities, beings of fragile constitution studied existence from the safety of controlled environments. The Institute's founders had built it with one sacred principle: preserve life by avoiding danger at all costs. For 12,000 cycles, no alarm had ever sounded within its walls. Violence was theoretical, fear was academic. Death existed only in historical archives, studied by species who had long ago engineered such primitive concerns out of their evolutionary paths. The Preservation Institute represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization, a place where the universe's mysteries could be unraveled without anyone ever risking actual harm. The corridors hummed with the gentle vibrations of climate control systems, maintaining exact atmospheric compositions for dozens of different physiologies. Gravity fields adjusted automatically as researchers from high-gravity worlds passed those from orbital habitats. Everything was measured, predicted, controlled. Then humanity sent its first research fellow, and the galaxy learned what terror truly sounded like. Dr. Maya Chen arrived on a Tuesday, though the Institute didn't technically observe Earth's arbitrary time divisions. She came through the docking bay with the casual confidence that had marked humanity's entry into galactic society a mere 30 cycles earlier, when an exploratory vessel had stumbled through a wormhole and emerged in civilized space. The galaxy had been preparing for first contact protocols for millennia, but no simulation had predicted humans. They came from a Class 12 Deathworld, a category previously believed incompatible with complex civilization. Their planet was a nightmare of tectonic instability, atmospheric electrical storms, predatory megafauna, microscopic pathogens, and gravitational forces that would crush most species. Yet somehow, impossibly, humans had not only survived but thrived. Maya stood barely 1.6 meters tall, compact by human standards, with dark hair pulled into what she called a ponytail, and eyes that reflected an unsettling alertness. She wore the Institute's standard atmospheric suit, modified for human tolerances, though she'd complained during orientation that it felt unnecessarily restrictive. Director Kelnash, a Vexthari whose species had eliminated physical risk from their society 8,000 cycles ago, had processed her arrival with barely concealed anxiety. The Vexithari were philosophers and theorists, their bodies having evolved into delicate frames that required constant environmental support. Kelnash's translucent skin revealed the gentle pulsing of nutrient fluids through carefully maintained channels. Even raising his voice above a whisper could cause dangerous strain. Dr. Chen, he had communicated through a neural translation interface, his actual voice too fragile to travel through standard atmosphere. The Preservation Institute welcomes humanity's contribution to our collective knowledge. However, I must emphasize that our protocols exist for the safety of all species. The regulations regarding physical conduct are not suggestions. Maya had smiled, an expression that still unsettled most aliens who witnessed the baring of teeth. I understand completely, Director. I'm here to learn, not to cause trouble. But there was something in her eyes, that peculiar human quality the galaxy was still attempting to catalog. Curiosity, perhaps, or the reckless confidence of a species that had clawed its way to sentience through countless extinctions. She was assigned to the xenobiology wing, studying comparative evolutionary biology under Dr. Seftal, a Quentari researcher whose ancestors had abandoned their planet's surface 30,000 cycles ago to live in orbital stations where danger was engineered out of existence. Seftal had 6 doctoral equivalents and had published extensively on survival strategies across low-risk environments. He approached Maya's first day with the kind of cautious optimism reserved for handling unstable chemical compounds. The laboratory was a masterpiece of safety design. Every surface was padded or rounded. Tools were voice-activated to prevent physical strain. Specimens were studied through multiple layers of containment fields. The air itself was filtered 17 times and maintained at a composition suitable for 80% of galactic species. Lighting was kept dim, as many researchers found bright illumination physiologically distressing. It was, by every measurable standard, the safest scientific environment in the known universe. Maya had been examining cellular structures from a recently discovered microorganism, one of the rare bacteria capable of surviving in the extreme environment of a nebula's edge. Her human hands, each finger possessing an unsettling degree of independent movement, manipulated the holographic display with practiced ease. Humans, the galaxy had learned, possessed extraordinary fine motor control, an evolutionary gift from ancestors who had crafted tools and climbed trees while predators hunted them. Seftal watched nervously from across the lab, his primary sensory stalks following her movements with the kind of attention one might give a live explosive. That's when the incident occurred. The microorganism's display suddenly destabilized, a minor technical glitch that caused the hologram to flicker and expand unexpectedly. For a fraction of a second, the magnified image of the bacterium filled Maya's field of vision, its cellular structures distorting into abstract patterns. It was harmless, merely a visual anomaly that would be corrected by the system's automatic stabilizers within moments. Any other researcher would have waited patiently for the reset, perhaps filed a maintenance report afterward. Maya jumped backward with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, her body moving in a blur of reaction time that evolution had honed over millions of cycles of avoiding predators. Her chair, not designed for such sudden force, skidded across the laboratory floor with a sound that echoed through the quiet space like a thunderclap. And then, as the hologram stabilized and Maya realized what had happened, she did something that would echo through the Institute for cycles to come. She laughed. It started as a chuckle, a rhythmic expulsion of breath that built into a full-bodied expression of amusement at her own startled reaction. The sound filled the laboratory raw and unfiltered, carrying harmonics that human vocal cords produced unconsciously. It was loud, far louder than any sound typically heard in the Institute's controlled environment. It was chaotic, lacking the measured tones of civilized communication. And it was utterly, incomprehensibly terrifying to every non-human within hearing range. Seftal's sensory stalks retracted completely, a defensive response his species hadn't needed in 30 millennia. His respiratory membranes fluttered in distress as his body's ancient instincts, buried under countless generations of safe evolution, suddenly screamed warnings of predator presence. The laugh to his auditory processing centers registered as an aggressive vocalization, the kind of sound an apex predator might make before attacking, his manipulator limbs locked in place, too frightened to move. Across the lab, a Thren researcher working with crystalline samples lost control of his gravitational field stabilizers. The crystals clattered to the floor, the sound adding to the chaos. In the adjacent chamber, separated by transparent aluminum walls, a team of Peshkin observers froze in place, their compound eyes dilating in a fear response that their psychologists would later struggle to explain. The laugh continued, Maya completely unaware of the panic she was causing, finding genuine humor in her own jumpiness, to understand why this simple human expression caused such widespread terror requires understanding. The fundamental difference between humanity and the rest of galactic civilization. Every spacefaring species had achieved their status by eliminating risk from their evolutionary path. The Vexthari had built underground cities after their sun became unstable. The Quentari had fled to space when their planet's ecosystem began collapsing. The Thren had genetically modified themselves into beings of pure energy to escape physical mortality. Each species had looked at danger and chosen to engineer it away, to build walls between themselves and the universe's harsh realities. They had survived by becoming cautious, measured, careful. Humans had survived by laughing at death and charging forward anyway. Maya's laughter was the sound of a species that had stared into the abyss and found it funny. It was the vocalization of beings who had domesticated wolves into companions, who had crossed frozen continents on foot, who had looked at the vacuum of space and saw not an insurmountable barrier, but an interesting challenge. When humans were frightened, they didn't freeze or flee. They laughed, processed the threat, and adapted. That laugh contained the entire history of humanity's relationship with danger: acknowledgement, assessment, and absolute refusal to be controlled by fear. The Institute's emergency response system, programmed to detect distress signals across 300 species communication spectrums, interpreted Maya's laughter as a hostile event. Alarms began to sound. Gentle vibrations and frequencies designed not to cause physiological damage but sufficient to alert security. Director Kel Nash received an immediate notification that a potential aggression event was occurring in Xenobiology Lab 7. Security drones, unarmed but capable of deploying containment fields, converged on the location. Across the Institute, researchers began evacuating their laboratories, following protocols designed for scenarios they'd never expected to actually experience. Maya's laugh faded naturally, her humor at her own startled reaction running its course. She wiped her eyes. A human gesture the Institute's cultural database had identified as related to emotional overflow, and turned to resume her work. That's when she noticed Seftal, still frozen at his workstation. His sensory stalks retracted and his entire body trembling with microscopic vibrations. She also noticed the security drones entering through the laboratory's pressure-sealed door. Their optical sensors focused on her with unwavering attention. "Oh no," she said, human vocal cords producing sounds that her species had evolved for complex verbal communication, across vast distances and through dense forests. Is everyone okay?" The question itself was so fundamentally human that it would later be analyzed by xenopsychology departments across a dozen universities. She had caused a panic, triggered institute-wide alarm systems, and her first response was to check on the well-being of others. Not to defend herself, not to explain, but to ensure she hadn't harmed anyone. It was the reaction of a species whose survival had depended not just on individual strength, but on collective cooperation, on maintaining social bonds even in the face of danger. Director Kel Nash arrived moments later, his atmospheric support system working overtime to manage his elevated stress levels. Through his neural interface, his words came carefully measured. "Dr. Chen, you have activated emergency protocols. Please explain the nature of the threat that prompted your vocalization." Maya looked around the laboratory, at the frightened researchers, the security drones, the flashing alert indicators, and slowly began to understand what had happened. Her expression shifted through several emotions that the Institute's observers would later replay in slow motion, analyzing each micro-movement of human facial muscles. Surprise, recognition, concern, and then something the analysts struggled to categorize. Embarrassment mixed with a renewed urge to laugh, suppressed out of consideration for those around her. "I'm so sorry," she said, keeping her voice deliberately soft, though even that was louder than most species' normal communication. "There's no threat. The hologram startled me and I laughed. It's a human thing. We laugh when we're surprised or when we find something funny. I didn't mean to scare anyone." She paused, looking at the frozen researchers, the security response, the evident distress her simple reaction had caused. "This is because I'm from a death world, isn't it?" The question hung in the laboratory's carefully filtered air. Yes, the galaxy silently answered. Yes, it was because she was human, because her species had evolved in an environment where laughter was a release mechanism for constant danger, where humor was a survival tool that allowed social groups to process trauma and continue functioning. It was because humans had learned to find joy in the face of terror, to make jokes about mortality, to laugh at their own fears as a way of diminishing their power. Kel Nash's response came slowly, each word carefully chosen. "Dr. Chen, the sound you produced registers in most species' threat assessment systems as an aggressive display. Your sudden movement triggered predator response instincts that many of us believed had been evolved out of our genetic lines millennia ago. You must understand that most civilized species do not find amusement in danger." Maya nodded, her human mind processing this new information with the adaptability that had allowed her species to colonize 6 planets in 30 cycles. "I understand. I'll be more careful. But..." She hesitated, and then that human quality emerged again, that irrepressible need to understand, to question, to push boundaries. "If you don't mind me asking, how do your species handle stress? If you don't laugh, what do you do when something frightens you?" The question exposed the fundamental divide between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. Civilized species didn't handle stress because they'd engineered stress out of their existence. They didn't need coping mechanisms for fear because they'd created societies where fear was obsolete. They'd built their civilizations on the principle that danger should be avoided, eliminated, prevented through careful planning and technological solutions. The concept of experiencing fear regularly enough to develop psychological tools for managing it was alien to them. Humans, Maya was beginning to understand, were the only species in the known galaxy who had brought their dangers with them to the stars. They hadn't left fear behind on Earth. They'd packed it in their cargo holds, carried it through wormholes, and maintained it as a companion, even in the safest corners of civilized space. Because for humans, fear and courage weren't opposites. They were partners in the eternal dance of survival. And laughter was the music they moved to. The galaxy was about to learn that you couldn't separate humanity from its Deathworld origins. And perhaps more terrifyingly, that humanity didn't want to. The education of civilized minds, the incident in Xenobiology Lab. 7 became known throughout the Preservation Institute as the laughter event, spoken in hushed tones with the kind of reverence typically reserved for natural disasters or historical tragedies. Within hours, every research department had been briefed on proper protocols when working near the human. Within days, xenopsychology teams from 3 star systems had requested permission to study Maya Chen's integration into civilized scientific society. Within a week, the Galactic Council itself had convened an emergency session to discuss whether humanity's admission to the Institute had been premature. Maya, for her part, found the entire situation both frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. She'd been assigned a liaison, a young Vexithari named Telka, whose job was essentially to follow her around and warn other researchers of her approach. It was meant to be a safety measure, but Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was being treated like a dangerous animal in a zoo, carefully monitored to ensure she didn't frighten the visitors. Telka was earnest and well-meaning, his translucent form constantly pulsing with nervous energy, and Maya had grown fond of him despite the awkwardness of their arrangement. "It's not personal," Telka explained one morning as they walked through the Institute's central promenade, other researchers giving them a wide berth. His neural interface translated his thoughts with perfect clarity, though Maya had learned to read the subtle shifts in his bioluminescent patterns that indicated emotional states. Most of the species here have evolved in very stable environments. The Quentari haven't experienced predation in 30,000 cycles. The Thren exist partially out of phase with normal matter, so they don't even have a concept of physical danger anymore. Your presence represents something they've never encountered: controlled risk. Maya adjusted the atmospheric suit that she still found unnecessarily restrictive, her human fingers working with the kind of dexterity that made most aliens uncomfortable. "But I'm not dangerous," she protested, keeping her voice at what she'd learned was an acceptable volume. "I'm a xenobiologist. I study microorganisms. The most threatening thing I do is peer at bacteria through a microscope." "You laugh," Telka said simply, and the 2 words carried the weight of the galaxy's collective unease. They were heading to a mandatory orientation session that Director Kelnash had organized specifically for departments that would be working with human researchers. Maya had been told that 17 more humans were being processed for various positions throughout the Institute, and the administration wanted to ensure that the next arrivals wouldn't trigger Institute-wide panic. As they entered the conference chamber, a space designed with variable gravity fields and atmospheric zones to accommodate multiple species simultaneously, Maya noticed that the room had been arranged with her at the center, and all other attendees maintaining a careful distance. It was like being a specimen in one of her own experiments. Director Kelnash floated at the head of the chamber, his Vexithari physiology requiring constant atmospheric support. Behind him, a holographic display showed various human activities, carefully curated from Earth's cultural databases. Maya recognized footage of human laughter in various contexts: friends sharing jokes, children playing, crowds at entertainment venues, athletes celebrating victories. To her, these were normal, joyful expressions of human social bonding. To the assembled aliens, they appeared to be displays of barely controlled chaos. "Thank you all for attending," Kelnash began, his neural interface projecting his thoughts to all present in their respective comprehension formats. "Today we begin a comprehensive education program regarding human behavioral patterns. Dr. Chen has graciously agreed to assist in this presentation, demonstrating various aspects of human expression that may be unsettling to those unfamiliar with Deathworlder physiology and psychology." Maya felt dozens of sensory organs turning toward her. Each species' version of vision or perception focused with the intensity of researchers studying a particularly dangerous chemical reaction. She raised her hand in a gesture of greeting, keeping the movement slow and deliberate, and several attendees visibly flinched. Humans, she was learning, moved with a speed that evolution had honed for environments where hesitation meant death. What felt like a casual gesture to her appeared sudden and aggressive to species whose movements had evolved for energy conservation, rather than quick reactions at the First part of the presentation focused on human vocalization. Kelnash played audio samples of various human sounds: laughter, crying, shouting, singing, even sneezing. Each sound was accompanied by detailed analysis of its harmonic structure, frequency range, and typical context within human social interaction. The assembled researchers took notes with the kind of meticulous attention Maya associated with weapons training, rather than cultural education. The laugh that Dr. Chen produced, Kelnash explained, isolating the audio from the laughter event and playing it back at reduced volume, contains frequency patterns that register in most species' auditory processing as alarm calls or aggression displays. Notice the irregular rhythm, the sudden volume changes, the lack of predictable harmonics. To human ears, this is apparently pleasant. To most of us, it triggers ancient survival instincts. A Thren researcher, her energy form flickering with curiosity, pulsed a question through the chamber's translation network. Are humans aware that they produce these threatening sounds? Is it a conscious intimidation display? Maya felt all attention shift to her. She took a breath, centering herself with the same calm she'd learned during her doctoral defense back on Earth, when she'd had to explain her controversial theories about extremophile evolution to a panel of skeptical professors. No, she said clearly, pleased that her voice didn't shake. Laughter is an involuntary response to humor, surprise, joy, sometimes nervousness. We don't control it any more than you control your bioluminescence patterns or gravitational field fluctuations. It's part of being human. We laugh because the alternative is to cry or scream, and humans figured out millions of years ago that laughter helps us survive. The silence that followed was profound. The concept she'd just presented, that vocalization could be an uncontrolled survival mechanism rather than deliberate communication, seemed to fundamentally challenge how most species understood sapient behavior. Civilized beings controlled their expressions. They chose their communications. The idea of involuntary emotional responses strong enough to override conscious choice suggested a lack of evolutionary refinement that troubled many in attendance. Dr. Seftal, who had been present during the laughter event and was still processing the trauma, extended a sensory stalk cautiously. Dr. Chen, you mentioned that laughter is an alternative to crying or screaming. Does this mean humans regularly experience emotions intense enough to require such explosive release? Maya considered how to explain the human emotional spectrum to beings who had engineered emotional extremes out of their genetic lines. Yes, she said finally. Humans feel things very deeply. Joy, sorrow, fear, excitement, anger, love. Our emotions are intense because our environment demanded quick, strong responses to constant threats. A predator doesn't wait for you to carefully analyze your fear. You feel it immediately and react. Over time, we developed ways to manage these intense emotions, and laughter is one of them. It releases stress, bonds social groups, helps us process trauma. It's not a threat. It's therapy. The word therapy required additional explanation through the translation network, as most species present had no concept of needing psychological treatment for emotional distress. Their societies had evolved beyond such primitive concerns. Mental health, as humans understood it, was simply not a factor in civilizations where stress had been systematically eliminated. The revelation that humans required regular emotional release mechanisms painted a picture of a species living in a constant state of barely managed psychological crisis. Kelnash moved the presentation forward, displaying holographic models of human physiology. The assembled researchers studied the images with the kind of fascinated horror typically reserved for studying predatory megafauna. Human musculature, optimized for climbing, running, throwing, and manipulating tools. Human skeletal structure, dense and heavy, adapted for Earth's crushing gravity. Human sensory organs, particularly the eyes, positioned forward for predator-like depth perception, rather than prey-like panoramic awareness. Human teeth, including prominent canines designed for tearing meat. Every aspect of human evolution screamed apex predator to species who had long ago abandoned such crude classifications. One of the most challenging aspects of human integration, Kelnash continued, is their relationship with risk. Dr. Chen, would you mind explaining the human concept of fun? Maya suppressed a smile, knowing that even that expression would be misinterpreted. Fun it's doing something that brings you joy or excitement. For humans, fun often involves an element of risk or challenge. We enjoy testing ourselves against difficulties. It stimulates our brains, makes us feel alive, Things like climbing mountains, racing vehicles, solving complex puzzles, competing in games. We seek out challenges because overcoming them is rewarding. You voluntarily expose yourselves to danger for entertainment? A Peshkin observer's compound eyes widened to their maximum diameter, a fear response so strong that nearby researchers moved away instinctively. This is considered normal behavior on your world? It's celebrated behavior, Maya corrected gently. We have entire industries dedicated to creating safe dangers for people to enjoy. We call them sports, adventure tourism, entertainment. We've built roller coasters, machines designed specifically to simulate the sensation of falling or moving at dangerous speeds, and millions of humans pay money to ride them. We jump out of perfectly functional aircraft with fabric parachutes for recreation. We climb sheer rock faces using only our hands and feet. We dive deep into oceans where our bodies shouldn't be able to survive. And yes, we think it's fun. The xenopsychology team was frantically recording every word. One researcher, a Quentari specialist in survival behaviors, was pulsing with such intense curiosity that his bioluminescence had increased to uncomfortable levels. But why? He asked, his voice carrying genuine bewilderment. Why would a sapient species deliberately court mortality? Maya had been thinking about this question since the laughter event, trying to understand the fundamental disconnect between humans and everyone else in the galaxy. Because we're not trying to avoid death, she said slowly, working through the philosophy as she spoke. We're trying to feel alive. There's a difference. Your species achieved civilization by eliminating threats and creating safety. You survived by being cautious. Humans survived by being bold. We looked at the dangerous universe and said, I bet we can handle that. We domesticated fire by repeatedly burning ourselves until we figured it out. We learned to navigate oceans by repeatedly drowning until we built better ships. We reached space by literally exploding ourselves upward on controlled bombs until we got the math right. Every human advancement came from someone somewhere saying, this might kill me, but let's try anyway. That's not recklessness. That's who we are. The silence in the conference chamber was absolute. Maya had just articulated something that the galaxy's greatest minds had been struggling to understand since humanity's emergence into civilized space. Humans weren't anomalies who had survived despite their Deathworld origins. They were successful because of them. Their entire civilization was built on the principle of confronting danger rather than avoiding it, of laughing at fear and charging forward. They were, in every meaningful sense, the opposite of everything galactic civilization had been built upon. Director Kel Nash, who had led the Preservation Institute for 40 cycles and thought he understood the full spectrum of sapient behavior, found himself reconsidering fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligence and civilization. Dr. Chen, he said carefully, are you suggesting that human advancement requires danger? That your species cannot progress without risk? No. Maya shook her head, another gesture that required explanation through the translation network. We can progress through careful research and safe experimentation, but we don't want to. Risk is part of what makes us human. Take it away and you take away something essential. Your species built this institute as a place where danger doesn't exist, where every variable is controlled, where nothing unexpected can happen. To you, that's paradise. To a human, that sounds like a prison. The word prison hit the assembled researchers like a physical blow. The Preservation Institute represented the pinnacle of galactic achievement, the ultimate expression of civilization's triumph over the universe's harsh realities. The idea that a species might perceive it as confining, limiting, restrictive, challenged their entire worldview. Were they not enlightened beings who had transcended primitive concerns? Had they not achieved the ultimate goal of any civilization, the elimination of suffering and danger? Telka, who had been silent throughout the presentation, suddenly pulsed with a pattern Maya had learned to recognize as deep contemplation. So when you laughed, he said, speaking directly to Maya for the first time in a public setting, you weren't expressing aggression. You were expressing the opposite. You were showing that you weren't afraid. Maya felt a surge of appreciation for the young Vexathari's insight. Exactly. I was startled, but I immediately recognized there was no real danger, and I laughed at myself for jumping. The laugh was me telling my own brain, relax, you're safe, it's funny. If I were actually in danger, I wouldn't be laughing. I'd be responding to the threat. And how do humans respond to actual threats? Asked Dr. Seftal, who had been studying human survival behaviors through academic literature, but had never encountered a human in a crisis situation. Maya's expression shifted, and even the most socially oblivious alien in the chamber recognized it as significant. Her features hardened slightly, her posture straightened, her eyes focused with predatory intensity. It was a subtle change, but to species whose survival instincts were being reawakened after millennia of dormancy, it was terrifying. This was the face of a Deathworlder preparing for battle, the expression of a species that had survived everything their violent world had thrown at them. "We assessed the threat level," Maya said, her voice taking on a different quality, more focused, more controlled. "We determine if we can fight, flee, or need to be clever. We make a plan, often in fractions of a second, and then we execute that plan with everything we have. Humans don't freeze when we're threatened. We don't accept danger passively. We respond, we adapt, we overcome. That's how we survived long enough to build civilization. That's how we made it to the stars. And that's why, with all due respect to everyone here, I will never stop laughing when something surprises me, because laughter means I'm still alive, still human, still capable of finding joy in a universe that's tried very hard to kill my species for millions of years." The presentation continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from human dietary requirements to sleep patterns to social hierarchies. But Maya's explanation of laughter and risk had fundamentally shifted the tone. The researchers weren't just learning about a new species anymore. They were confronting the unsettling reality that perhaps the path to civilization wasn't as universal as they'd believed. Humanity had taken a completely different route, one that valued courage over caution, adaptation over avoidance, and laughter over silence. As the session concluded and researchers began filing out, maintaining their careful distance from Maya, Telka approached her with unusual boldness. "Dr. Chen," he said, his bioluminescence pulsing with what she'd learned was excitement, "would you be willing to teach me about human humor? I want to understand why you laugh. I want to know what it's like to find danger funny." Maya studied the young Vexthari, seeing in him something she recognized from her own early academic career. Curiosity that went beyond safe boundaries, a willingness to engage with uncomfortable truths. The seed of something that might, given time and courage, bloom into genuine understanding. "I'd be happy to," she said, and this time she didn't suppress her smile. "But I should warn you, human humor can be pretty dark. We make jokes about death, disaster, and our own failings. We laugh at things that would horrify most species. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Telka's bioluminescence flared with determination, a pattern his species typically reserved for confronting existential threats. "Dr. Chen," he said, "I've spent my entire life in environments designed to eliminate all risk. I've studied the universe through layers of protection and safety protocols. I've never experienced real danger, never faced a genuine challenge, never had to make a decision that truly mattered. If understanding human laughter means confronting uncomfortable truths, then maybe that's exactly what I need." Maya felt hope blooming in her chest, warm and unexpected. Perhaps the galaxy wasn't as divided as she'd thought. Perhaps curiosity, that most human of traits, existed in other species too, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. "Okay," she said. "Lesson 1 in human humor. Sometimes you have to laugh at the universe because the alternative is to let it break you. Ready?" "Ready," Telka confirmed, and for the first time since arriving at the Institute, Maya felt like she might actually belong here. The ripple that became a wave 3 months after the laughter event, the Preservation Institute had settled into an uneasy routine with its human contingent. 17 human researchers now worked throughout various departments, each one a walking reminder that the galaxy's understanding of civilization might be incomplete. They moved through the crystalline halls with their characteristically quick movements, spoke with their unsettlingly loud voices, and occasionally, despite the best efforts at cultural sensitivity, laughed. The laughter no longer triggered institute-wide emergency protocols. That was progress. Researchers had learned to distinguish between Maya Chen's amused chuckle and her startled yelp. They recognized that Dr. James Wang's booming laugh at mealtimes wasn't an aggression display, but rather his response to colleague Dr. Sarah Okoye's apparently hilarious stories about her previous research expedition. They'd even begun to understand that when humans showed their teeth in what they called smiling, it wasn't a threat, but rather an invitation to social bonding. But understanding and accepting were different things entirely. The Real change began not with any dramatic incident, but with something far more subtle: questions. The younger researchers, those who hadn't yet fully internalized their species' cultural aversion to risk, started approaching the humans with increasing frequency. They wanted to know things that academic databases couldn't answer. What did danger feel like? How did fear taste? Why would anyone choose to experience such sensations? And most persistently, what made something funny? Telka had become an unofficial bridge between worlds. His sessions with Maya, initially focused on understanding human humor, had evolved into broader philosophical discussions about the nature of sapience, civilization, and what it meant to truly live rather than merely exist safely. He'd started cataloging human jokes, trying to understand their structure and purpose. His research notes had grown into a substantial database that other young researchers were quietly accessing, fascinated by this glimpse into a completely alien psychology. "Okay," Maya said during one of their regular sessions, held in a small observation lounge overlooking the Institute's view of the nebula beyond. "Here's a classic human joke format. Knock, 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 knock." Telka's bioluminescence pulsed with confusion, his neural interface struggling to find context for these words in this sequence. "No, you're supposed to say, 'Who's there?'" Maya explained patiently. This was their 43rd attempt at getting through a single knock-knock joke, and she was beginning to understand why human humor didn't translate well to species who had evolved without doors, territoriality, or the concept of unwanted visitors. "But I know you're there," Telka protested, his logic perfectly sound from a Vexathari perspective. "I can see your bioluminescence, hear your respiratory patterns, and detect your electromagnetic signature. Why would I need to ask who's there?" Maya laughed, and this time Telka didn't flinch. He'd grown accustomed to the sound, even found it oddly pleasant, like listening to a storm from inside a secure shelter. "That's actually a good point," she admitted. "Knock-knock jokes are built on a social convention that doesn't exist in your culture. Let me try a different kind. What's the difference between a human and a Vexathari?" Telka's sensory stalks perked up with interest. This sounded like a riddle, and the Vexathari loved riddles. "I don't know, what's the difference?" "A human thinks danger is exciting. A Vexathari thinks excitement is dangerous." There was a pause while Telka processed this. His bioluminescence flickered through several patterns as his mind worked through the logical structure, the wordplay, the underlying truth. And then something remarkable happened. Telka made a sound that human vocal cords couldn't have produced, a harmonic vibration that resonated through his entire body. It wasn't laughter as humans knew it, but it served the same function: the recognition of an amusing truth, the acknowledgement of a clever observation, the release of tension through humor. Maya stared at him, her human eyes wide with surprise and delight. "Did you just laugh?" I think I did," Telka responded, his bioluminescence now pulsing with what could only be described as excitement. "That was." The statement contained a truth about both our species while simultaneously being structured to surprise the listener with its reversal of expected logic. It created a moment of cognitive dissonance that resolved into understanding, accompanied by what humans would call pleasure. Is that what humor feels like? Yes. Maya was practically bouncing in her seat, a movement that would have terrified most Institute residents, but which Telka now recognized as human enthusiasm. That's exactly what humor feels like. You got a joke. You actually understood and appreciated human humor. Word of Telka's breakthrough spread through the younger researchers like a virus, except this was a virus that caused excitement rather than disease. If a Vexathari could understand human humor, could learn to find amusement in patterns that had previously registered as threatening, what else might be possible? Could other species learn to appreciate danger, to find joy in challenge, to laugh at fear? The older generation of researchers, including Director Kelnash, viewed these developments with increasing alarm. They'd spent their entire careers building a civilization based on safety, stability, and the elimination of risk. The humans weren't just introducing new scientific perspectives, they were fundamentally challenging the philosophical foundations of galactic society. If risk could be good, if danger could be exciting, if fear could be managed rather than eliminated, what did that say about 12,000 cycles of carefully constructed civilization? The crisis point came unexpectedly, as most genuine crises do. A stellar cartography expedition had returned with samples from a newly discovered asteroid field, materials that might provide insights into the early formation of the galaxy. The samples were scheduled for analysis in the Geological Studies laboratory, a process that would normally take several weeks of careful methodical examination through multiple layers of safety protocols. The samples were potentially unstable, containing compounds that might react unpredictably to standard atmospheric conditions. Dr. Marcus Bennett, one of the human geologists, made the mistake of expressing his opinion about the proposed analysis timeline. Several weeks for preliminary spectroscopy? We could have basic composition data in a few hours if we just ran direct analysis. The Thren laboratory supervisor, a being of partially phased matter named Vreshikol, flickered with alarm at the suggestion. Direct analysis would require exposing the samples to our atmosphere without full containment protocols. The risk of adverse reactions is non-zero. It's barely above zero, Marcus countered, his human mind automatically calculating acceptable risk thresholds in ways that baffled his alien colleagues. We're talking about geological samples, not biological hazards. I've analyzed thousands of similar materials back on Earth and in the belt. The standard human protocol would be to... Human protocols, Vreshikol interrupted, his energy form, pulsing with barely controlled distress, are based on accepting catastrophic risk as normal operating procedure. We do not conduct research that way at the Preservation Institute. We eliminate variables before proceeding. We ensure absolute safety before any experiment begins. That is the civilized approach. The argument would have remained a minor interdepartmental disagreement if not for what happened next. Marcus, frustrated by what he perceived as excessive caution, made a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable to his human mind, but appeared utterly reckless to everyone else present. He picked up one of the asteroid samples, a small chunk of rocky material no larger than his fist, and held it up to examine its crystalline structure in the laboratory's natural light. The reaction was instantaneous and dramatic. Vreshikol's energy form destabilized completely, flickering out of phase as his species' ultimate fear response triggered. 2 Quentari assistants evacuated the laboratory so quickly they left behind their recording equipment. A Peshkin observer released distress pheromones strong enough to trigger respiratory distress in several nearby species, and the Institute's security systems, registering multiple simultaneous panic signals, automatically sealed the laboratory and summoned emergency response teams. Marcus, who had simply been looking at a rock and seeing no danger whatsoever, found himself standing alone in a sealed laboratory with alarms echoing through the Institute, utterly confused about what had just happened. "It's just a rock," he said aloud to no one in particular, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone who had accidentally triggered a catastrophe without understanding how. The emergency response team arrived within minutes, but they stopped at the laboratory entrance, unwilling to enter, while the threat remained uncontained. Through the transparent aluminum walls they could see Marcus still holding the asteroid, sample examining it with the casual curiosity of a geologist doing what geologists do. To him, this was science. To them, this was madness. Maya got the call from Telka within minutes. "Dr. Chen, we have a situation. Dr. Bennett is in Geological Studies Lab 3 with an uncontained sample. The facility is in emergency lockdown. Director Kelnash is convening an emergency meeting about human risk tolerance, and I think this might be bad, really bad. He's talking about suspending human research privileges until proper safety protocols can be established." Maya was already moving, her human body covering ground with the efficient speed that still startled aliens in corridors. "Tell Marcus not to do anything else. I'm on my way." She arrived to find a crowd of researchers and security personnel clustered outside the sealed laboratory, maintaining the careful distance that seemed to be humanity's permanent social radius in civilized space. Marcus was visible through the transparent walls, now sitting casually on a laboratory stool, still holding the rock, looking more annoyed than frightened. Maya could read his body language perfectly. He was irritated by the overreaction, confused by the panic, and starting to get angry at being treated like he'd done something wrong. Director Kelnash floated at the front of the crowd, his vexithari physiology showing clear signs of stress. "Dr. Chen, he said through his neural interface, his tone carrying the weight of someone forced to make a difficult decision. This incident demonstrates exactly why we had concerns about human integration. Dr. Bennett has violated basic safety protocols, exposed himself and potentially others to unquantified risk, and caused widespread distress among institute staff. The Council is currently debating whether humanity's approach to scientific research is fundamentally incompatible with civilized standards. Maya looked at Marcus, at the rock he was holding, at the terrified aliens surrounding a situation that posed approximately zero actual danger. She looked at Telka, whose bioluminescence was pulsing with distress at seeing his friend face institutional consequences. She looked at the other human researchers who had gathered, their expressions showing frustration and resignation in equal measure. And she made a decision that would change everything. "With respect, Director," she said, keeping her voice calm, but allowing it to carry the full weight of human determination. "This isn't about safety protocols. This is about two completely different philosophies of existence, and it's time we stopped pretending one is objectively right and the other is objectively wrong." She walked toward the laboratory entrance, ignoring the gasps and alarmed movements from the surrounding aliens. "I'm going to unseal this lab and go inside. Dr. Bennett and I will conduct a proper geological analysis of that sample, following human safety protocols, and we'll document every step. Anyone who wants to understand how humanity approaches science is welcome to observe. Anyone who doesn't can leave, but I'm done apologizing for being human." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Telka's bioluminescence suddenly flared with unprecedented brightness, a pattern that every Vexithari present recognized as the physical manifestation of a radical decision. "I want to observe," he said, his neural interface projecting his words with surprising force. "I want to see how Deathworlders conduct research. I want to understand what Dr. Chen means by proper human protocols." The crowd stirred uncomfortably. A young researcher observing humans from a distance was one thing. Voluntarily entering an environment where humans were conducting uncontained analysis was something else entirely. It was, by the standards of civilized society, insane. But Telka wasn't alone. A Quentari graduate student named Prilenth, who had been secretly downloading human research papers and trying to understand their methods, pulsed with nervous determination. "I also want to observe." Then another voice, and another, until nearly 20 researchers, all young, all from the generation that hadn't fully absorbed their species' risk aversion protocols, had volunteered to witness human science in action. Director Kelnash's bioluminescence flickered through patterns that suggested he was experiencing more emotional complexity than Vexithari typically processed. "This is highly irregular. The Council will need to approve such an observation protocol. The insurance implications alone